What did Ku Klux Klan fighters do in the courtroom when death sentences were pronounced on them? What atrocities did they manage to commit while free?
My name is Knox.
I will show you the most cruel and motivated criminals of the white brotherhood who showed no mercy even towards children.
And I'll start with one of America's most infamous racists.
Fraser Glenn Miller Jr. entered history as a notorious figure and ruthless extremist. This man, a former leader of the so-called White Patriots Party, formerly known as the Knights of Carolina Ku Klux Klan, became famous not only for his far-right views, but also for monstrous crimes that even take my breath away. On April 13, 2014, Miller committed horrific shootings in Overland Park, Kansas. He attacked a Jewish community center and a retirement home, killing 3 people. Before opening fire, Miller would ask people if they were Jews, and upon receiving an affirmative answer, he would shoot at point-blank range. Horrific, right?
How did he become such a person?
It all started with a brochure called The Thunderbolt, with racist theses, which his father gave him once. After being discharged from the U.S. Army in 1979 for spreading racist propaganda, Miller founded the Knights of Carolina Ku Klux Klan, which later transformed into the White Patriots Party. Despite numerous accusations of crimes and extreme views, Miller even attempted to hold public office, albeit without much success. And in 2014, he decided to act more radically, announcing himself to the world. On the day before the shooting, Miller, according to his wife, was at the casino and even called her, saying that everything was fine. But less than 3 hours after that call, he killed 3 people, including a 14-year-old child. After the attack, Miller was arrested near an elementary school, shouting Nazi slogans and brandishing weapons. In court, he showed no remorse and even boasted of feeling during the attack. On August 31, 2015, he was found guilty of murder and other crimes, after which he was sentenced to death. Miller died in prison in 2021 from natural causes, never having faced his sentence. Horrible person, but believe me, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Meet Edgar Ray Killen, another prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan, who in 1964 planned the murder of 3 people: Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. These 3 civil rights activists participated in the so-called Freedom Summer of the same year in Mississippi. On that fateful day, they visited victims of the burning of a black church. After the visit, police officer Edgar Ray, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, arrested the men on the pretext of speeding. There was no evidence of this, but he simply tried to stall to warn his accomplices, who waited until the volunteers were released. What happened next? Pursuit, car ramming, and shooting right on the road. The bodies of the men were found 44 days later, buried in a dam. Surprisingly, but at that time the state of Mississippi refused to prosecute those responsible. There were radical sentiments in society, and African Americans were strongly disliked. However, in 1967, the policy changed, and 18 people were arrested, including Ku Klux Klan leader Sam Bowers, the sheriff, and his deputy Edgar Ray Killen. Most of them were sent to prison, except for Killen. He managed to avoid punishment. But don't rush, justice still prevailed, albeit almost 40 years later. Journalist Jerry Mitchell took up the investigation of this case. He found new witnesses and evidence of Killen's involvement, including the fact that he planned these murders. In 2005, at the age of 80, Killen was arrested again. The case was brought to court, where he was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison, which essentially meant life imprisonment. For him, it was even worse than the death penalty. To be a feeble old man in prison even sounds horrible. Edgar Ray Killen died in prison in 2018, never repenting of his crimes.
Here's another bunch of racists, but not too bright.
Sean Berry, Lawrence Brewer, and John King in 1998 deprived James Byrd Jr. of his life. This happened in Jasper, Texas. These 3 men offered James a ride, but instead of taking him home, they drove him into the woods. There, they beat the guy and dragged him several miles behind a Ford pickup truck. James's skin and flesh were worn to the bone. They simply dumped the dead guy in front of a black church, where he was found the next morning. A horrific scene I can't even imagine. There were no surveillance cameras or witnesses at the murder scene, so how were these villains caught? It turned out to be simpler than you might think. The men weren't too bright. Police found a wrench with the inscription Barry in the murder area, obviously belonging to Sean Barry. Also found was a lighter with the inscription Possum. This was the prison nickname of John King. Lawrence Brewer and John King were known as avid supporters of the white movement, even participating in torchlight processions. King had tattoos with the symbols of the hate group, Confederate Knights of America. So the police didn't even have to make much effort to find the suspects. In 2011, the court found Sean, Lawrence, and John guilty of James's murder. Lawrence Brewer was executed by injection, and in 2019, the same fate befell John King. Sean Barry was sentenced to life imprisonment, but there is a possibility that he will be released in 2038.
Moving on.
Meet Russell Courtier, a member of the racist prison gang who committed the murder of Larnell Bruce Jr. by running him over with his Jeep. This happened at a 7-Eleven store in Gresham, Oregon, near Portland. The guys had a conflict over racial insults, Courtier beat up Bruce, and then simply ran over his head with the Jeep. In court, prosecutors emphasized that Courtier belonged to the prison racist gang European Kindred, and he even had tattoos with their symbolism. Prosecutor David Hannon stated that a life sentence was justified because the jury concluded that Courtier killed Bruce because of his racist beliefs. The victim's mother, Christina Miles, addressed Courtier saying, "You allowed the devil to lead you astray and took the life of such a beautiful young soul. Could you explain why?" He just looked evil at her. Despite all the evidence of Courtier's racist tendencies, his mother spoke up in his defense, saying he was never a racist, mentioning friendships with families that include both black and white people. Courtier's girlfriend, Colleen Hunt, admitted to allowing him to use her Jeep to kill Bruce. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Courtier was found guilty on 3 counts: murder, failure to perform the duties of a driver, and violating Oregon's hate crime law. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, only because of the moratorium on the death penalty in this state. Although, here, I don't know what would be a better punishment. Daniel Lewis Lee, also known in white circles as Danny Lee, one of the most recognizable and brutal supporters of the white brotherhood. He devoted half of his life to violence and terror. Born on January 31, 1973 in Yukon, Oklahoma, Lee grew up in a family where he often faced neglect and beatings. At 17, he received 5 years probation for assaulting a man named Joseph Joey on July 24, 1990. Together with his cousin John David Patton, they attacked Joseph, took his belongings, and disposed of his clothes, throwing his body into a ditch. Lee confessed to robbery, and his cousin was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. 2 years later, Lee and his friend Shavy committed one of the most brutal murders in Arkansas history, killing 3 family members, including a husband, his wife, and their 8-year-old daughter in January 1996. They arrived at the home of William Frederick Miller, a gun dealer disguised as FBI agents. When the family returned home, Lee and Chevy tied them up. They tortured the 8-year-old daughter with a stun gun to find out where the money and weapons were kept, all in front of the parents. Can you imagine? As a result, they found $50,000 in cash and coveted weapons. After that, they played with the stun gun and the victims, then put plastic bags over their heads, taped them, and watched them suffocate. The bodies were thrown into the Illinois Bayou swamp with rocks tied to them. Nancy Mueller, one of the victim's mother, spoke out against Lee's death penalty, stating that it would not bring her daughter back or bring relief. But the court was relentless. On July 13, 2020, Lee was transferred to the Terre Haute Federal Prison, where at 8:08 in the morning on July 14th, he was given a lethal injection. Here's a whole family affair, and one of the most scandalous stories in recent years. Ahmaud, a young black man, went for a run in the Satilla Shores area, Georgia. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, but 3 white men mistook him for a thief and began to pursue him. Seeing the aggressive strangers, the runner only increased his pace. But the road was blocked by 2 cars, one with Travis McMichael and his father Gregory McMichael armed with rifles, and the other with their neighbor William Roddie Bryan. Travis got out of the car and began poking the runner with a gun, shouting Nazi insults, and then shot him at point-blank range. Bryan recorded all this on his mobile phone. After the Glynn County Police arrived, they simply shrugged. There were no arrests. The prosecutor tried to hush up the case. The police only reacted after the video of Ahmaud's murder went viral on social media, causing global outrage and raising questions about racial discrimination in the U.S. Jackie Johnson, former district attorney of Brunswick, was charged with obstructing law enforcement and bias. In November 2021, the three men were found guilty of committing a serious crime: assault, unlawful imprisonment, and subsequent murder. State laws did not allow even the shooter to be sentenced to death. They were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In court, the men expressed no regrets or reactions when their sentences were read. They believed they were just exercising vigilance.
Horrible, isn't it?
And this is Jeremy Christian, a self-proclaimed supporter of the White Brotherhood who, in May 2017, became the perpetrator of tragic events in Portland. What happened? On a bright spring day, hundreds of people boarded the Green Line Max train bound for the Clackamas Town Center. The ride, which was supposed to be ordinary, turned into a nightmare. Under the influence of alcohol, Christian began spewing hateful speeches at two black teenage girls, one of whom was a Muslim and wore a hijab. Witnesses reported that Christian continued to shout threats of beheading, and the train conductor even threatened to call the police if he didn't stop. Train passengers tried to persuade Christian to stop, but the situation quickly deteriorated. Christian pulled out a knife and in 11 seconds struck 3 passengers who were trying to calm him down. 2 died on the spot, and 1 was hospitalized with a neck laceration. Christian attempted to flee the scene but was soon apprehended. The tragedy shook the entire Portland community, with many wondering how such a thing could happen. One of the deceased, Ricky Best, was an Army veteran and a Portland City employee. His son, recalling his father's words, said, "I cannot stand by and do nothing." Do you think the killer showed remorse in court? No, of course not. During the trial, Christian began to swear and threaten to kill a relative of one of the victims, leading to his removal from the courtroom. He was sentenced to death, which by state laws was commuted to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and an additional 25 years for other crimes after pleading guilty to 12 counts, including first-degree murder, assault, and hate crimes. That's quite a sentence. Christian showed no remorse in his actions, and even tried to justify them by claiming there were 3 of them against 1.
Normal, right?
But if in the previous cases racists received really strict sentences, then this case will greatly surprise and outrage you. Harry Rogers, president of the Virginia chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, in 2021 was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Did he steal ice cream from a store? No, for ramming a crowd of black protesters gathered because of the murder of George Floyd. Harry Rogers drove his truck into a group of people, resulting in various injuries, but fortunately, no one died. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of assault, 1 count of property destruction, and 1 count of hit and run. Later, videos from Klan meetings surfaced, confirming that his actions were not accidental, but premeditated. Normal, right? You try to commit a mass terrorist act, but you miscalculate a bit and people survive. And you get punished as if you stole something from a store. Is that normal? I think it's too fair and even dangerous for society in the future.